Sun so bright. Okay, so hey guys, this is going to be a two-part video. The first part I'm going to talk about dimensions, sort of how I think of them and what I understand the word is trying to refer to, because language is an abstraction and isn't actually what this is. But the second part of the video is going to be on parallel universes and how understanding dimensions can kind of help us to understand what universes are, what multiverses are, and what all of physical reality within the third dimension is, kind of, in a sense. So yeah, see you in a sec. Enjoy the video. Hey, so I had an interesting thought today to kind of talk about parallel universes and dimensions, try to describe that, see if we can conceptualize more than just the third dimension, because we have ways of describing things, but that doesn't necessarily mean we have ways of understanding things. So yeah, I wanted to just start real quick with dimensions and then hopefully get into parallel universes and explain how through certain practices and whatnot you can shift the probability of you being in a certain timeline or parallel universe. Okay, so first off, this is the third dimension, physical reality. That means that things here are described by three dimensions, namely length, width, and height. And so that sort of describes how things have material forms. What is this dimension made out of? Energy, just like everything else, except some of the energy is compacted and formed into a specific structure that basically gives it a certain behavior. And that's how the same type of energy can make different types of materials. And so basically, when you look at something in the physical dimension, what you're seeing is how the energy that forms the construct of its existence is behaving. So naturally, skin behaves differently from hair. These bricks behave differently from these leaves. And when you get into the really, really interesting complex stuff, like actual individual organisms, that is a whole system of energy. It is not just one type of energy compacted into a glob. It is like several facets of multiple layers of being. There's a squirrel sitting on the bench, just watching. I wonder if he understands any of this, or if he's just like, guy's doing a lot of talking over there. Anyway, got distracted. So, when we perceive things in the third dimension, and we perceive the sort of physicality, materialness of it, what we're perceiving is the way the energy of the construct that makes that thing behaves. I'm not exactly sure where this ties in, but if you want to learn a little bit more about the connection between energy and matter and how they basically shift and adopt their behavior, look up videos on YouTube about the double slit experiment, which is basically the way people discovered that light isn't just a particle and it isn't just a wave either. It's technically both, but it's more than that. It's really cool. So, going down from the third dimension, you get to the second dimension. Now, the second dimension, instead of being defined by length, width, and height, is defined by simply length and height. One way to think of this is, instead of a plane of planes, the second dimension is just a singular plane. This doesn't mean it isn't infinite. All dimensions are technically infinite, because even in the third dimension, which is sort of defined by barriers and limitations, sort of between different states of energy behaving in different ways, The second dimension can sort of be described the same, except just as if it were flat. Literally, it is the same but flat. So this is really interesting because in the third dimension, you can move typically along 2 dimensions at a time. Hey guys, so excuse me while I butcher this explanation of dimensional movement relative to dimensional perception. Basically, the idea I'm trying to get to in this part of the clip is that within X dimension of space or reality, not really space, but being, movement is restricted to X minus 1 dimensions. And I'm not exactly sure how to explain this right now. I'll probably write about it and put it on my website. But there's 2 or 3 great videos featuring a talk from Neil deGrasse Tyson about dimensional perception and dimensional movement, and he uses Monsters, Inc. to describe it, which is wonderful and actually incredibly informative and insightful. And I'll put the link in the description, but for now, let's get back to the video. So, movement for the third dimension kind of works like a sphere. You can go from the center of the sphere to any point on its surface. That is sort of the limitations, or at least the availability of movement in the third dimension. However, when you're moving, even though you're moving in third dimensional space, you are moving in sort of a 2-dimensional way. In the second dimension, instead of a sphere, it's more like a circle. And you can move from the center of the circle to any point on the perimeter of the circle, which then is sort of more like 1-dimensional movement, because even if you're going just right, you can no longer go right to the north or right to the south. You can only go right, and there is only one way to go right. So going right is literally traveling along a line. It is so flat and linear that it literally doesn't even have sort of what we would think of as north, south, east, and west, that kind of are derived from poles and being on objects with poles. Because when you think about it, we're literally on a ball in space. And by space, I don't even necessarily mean outer space, just in the middle of some volume of space. We are on a ball, just floating around. So, why does this keep getting crazy? Because so far, the abstraction from the third dimension to the second dimension doesn't seem too complex. Well, the thing is, when you go down from the second dimension to the first dimension, still everything you perceive, all of the constructs of reality, are just behaving in ways that the energy of that sort of construct system behaves, necessarily describing the way it presents itself and how it actually manifests into reality. When you go down from the second to the first dimension, and this is where things start to get a lot harder to conceptualize, instead of things being described by the relation of length to height, things are now only described by their relation, just by the relation sort of comparatively of their length. The first dimension is no longer a plane, it is a single line of points. So how do you move along the first dimension? Well, you could go down the line, but going down the line wouldn't necessarily be movement, because it'd sort of be like, considering you're on a line with no end to either side, you would always be in the middle point that you're at. So movement is even more of an illusion, I think, or at least some weird thing that our minds probably can't understand. Movement is even weirder on the first dimension, because When you get down to that level, it's just you and what you're next to. Not even necessarily what's around you, because things can only either be on one side or the other. And when you break it down, it's interesting, because in the third dimension, the sort of highest level of abstraction is in sort of a fourth dimensional way. Like moving within and without of something. Let's say you have a thing that can be in the same volume as other things because it doesn't have matter. The easiest way to reference this sort of thing would be the mind. Where is the mind? There's no answer for that, because the mind isn't a physical thing. It doesn't have a place. It doesn't share or take up volume because it has no mass. Consciousness is very much the same. The mind is just sort of a abstract program of consciousness. So necessarily, when you reduce the dimensional layers of reality, consciousness or immaterial metaphysical things within that plane of reality also have more or less limitations on its relation to that reality. In the third dimension, consciousness can move through matter. I'm not exactly sure how to describe it more than that, but consciousness is like a field overlaying all of this, and you can sort of learn how to get your consciousness to move through the field and sort of be in different places at the same time. On lower dimensions, or not lower dimensions, but like fewer dimensions, however, on the second dimension, if your consciousness, which is really awareness, but like active conscious awareness, if you were to spread your consciousness along or through the second dimension, what you would basically be doing is, instead of sort of looking down the plane that you're on, you would be looking at the plane that you're on, which is really weird, because in order to understand that, we kind of have to think about it spatially. Like, okay, well, here's the plane, and if consciousness kind of backs up, it can look at all of the plane. But the thing is, consciousness can't back up, it can only expand and spread, which is how we understand it, because we're in the third dimension where, say, if you took something and you inflated it, that would be expansion. And so, sort of expanding your awareness is literally getting it to encompass multiple, or at least different, sort of material volumes. Going back to dimensions, in the first dimension, if things are just a line, say you're a point on that line, maybe sort of like a strip of something blue, and on one side there's a strip of something green, and on the other side there's a strip of something red. I didn't even mean to use RGB as sort of the colors for that, but I mean, hey, if it works, it works. So you're there, you're represented by a thing, and there are different things bordering you. Your immediate awareness would just be maybe your point, or if you were perceiving reality as well and not just yourself, your point and whichever direction down the line you're facing. To sort of expand from that would be to perceive the line. And it's really interesting, because basically what I'm getting at here is consciousness has the ability to step outside of the box and see the big picture of the dimensions of its reality. So, since consciousness, in perceiving all of this energy and matter, sort of hallucinates an experience for it in order to understand the dimensions of its existence. Let's see, where am I going with this? I had the words, and no, I have the words. Right. In order for consciousness to perceive its reality, it hallucinates it, places it into being, gives it sort of definition or dimensionality so that it can sort of actually understand and perceive the difference between the things that it's perceiving. Even though everything is made of energy, the energy is behaving differently, providing different information. So, what if you went down to the 0th, if that's a word, dimension? You go down to the first dimension, or you go down from the second dimension, you go down from the third dimension to the second dimension. So everything loses depth and now becomes a plane. You go down from the second dimension to the first dimension. Everything loses sort of its spread and becomes a succinct line. If you go down from the first dimension to the sort of 0 dimension, what happens? Well, you could say everything shrinks down on that line into a single point. But what does it mean for everything to only exist in one point? It's a wild idea, isn't it?